Hi everyone, and welcome to this presentation on Introduction to Policy Analysis. This is actually the second to the last video on the Gilbert and Terrell Policy Analysis Framework. So this is week 8 in the course, and this is going to be part 1 on the source of funds when it comes to the framework. As with all the other videos, this content is mainly from Dimensions of Social Welfare Policy by Gilbert and Terrell. Okay, just by way of review, I want to kind of remind us of where we are. So when it comes to the framework for analysis of product, which is what we've been focusing on here, we have what are the basis of social allocations as the first question in the framework, and this was about who is benefiting from the policy. Then we had the types of social provisions to be allocated, which had to do with what benefits the recipients would be receiving. And then thirdly, there was what are the strategies for delivery of those provisions. So that had to do with how the benefits were actually going to be given in terms of the design of the delivery system. Here now we are focusing on what are the ways to finance all of these provisions, all of these benefits. So where is the source of funds and how will it get from that source to the deliverer of the benefits? Now, there are two methods of finance in the Gilbert and Terrell framework, and these involve two sets of choices. First, we have to understand what the source of the funds are, or is. The source is. And then also the system of transfer. So when it comes to the source of funds, this has to do with just this basic question of where are the funds coming from that will be used to implement the policy. And there are many different ways, taxes, voluntary contributions, charging people, or any combination of the above. When it comes to system of transfer, this has to do with the arrangements that govern the flow of that money from the level of the government that raised the funds to the level that they're being used at. So this includes not only the different levels of review between funders and providers, but also the conditions that are placed on the transfer of those funds. In this video, we're going to focus on the source of funds. Now, as I mentioned, there are three main sources. There are taxes, voluntary giving, and recipient fees. Although on the surface these may seem like separate sources of funds, agencies actually oftentimes use combinations of these in order to fund services. So although there are separate streams, agencies used often what is called braided funding in order to provide services. So at the individual agency level, this is often referred to as braided funding, but on a larger sort of macro scale, we call this the mixed economy of welfare. Okay, let's talk about taxes. Taxes are compulsory, which means that we cannot refuse to pay them. Well, we could, but then there would be consequences like jail. So for our purposes, they're compulsory. They allow for distribution and in some cases redistribution of resources. And government/public finance via taxes is the main source of funding for most social welfare programs. This is one of the reasons why social welfare policy choices are inherently political and why there is so much controversy surrounding so many of the programs that we have that come from these policy choices. What's also interesting is this idea of how taxes are the main source of funding for our social welfare programs, because if we look at different countries, we can see the value that they place on using taxes for these purposes. So for example, in the US, about 25% of our gross domestic product goes to taxes, compared to Canada, where it's 31%, and the UK, where it's 36%. So, somewhat higher than the US. Now, when we compare these figures to countries that spend more on social welfare programs, then we can see a large difference in the taxes that get paid. So, like France, for example, 43% of their GDP goes to taxes. And then if we compare socially democratic countries, it's even bigger. So 46% for Sweden and 48% for Denmark. So it's really interesting to compare 25% versus 48% in terms of the US and Denmark, respectively. There are different types of taxes that are used to fund all of the different programs and other outlays that we have in terms of roads and libraries, etc. The first type of tax is the income tax. Another type is sales, property taxes, estate taxes, and taxes on gifts of a certain amount. Out of all of these, income is by far the largest single source of federal income. So it's about 45% of all the income that the federal government takes in. When we think of these taxes, we sort of have to kind of put them on a continuum in terms of redistribution. And there are two terms that are important to know about that are the two extremes of this continuum, progressive and regressive. So taxes are either progressive or regressive when it comes to distribution or redistribution. So what are progressive taxes? Progressive taxes like income are proportionally higher for the wealthy than for the poor. So as income rises, so does the tax rate. Plus, it's important to note that most people who are impoverished are exempt from the federal income tax and are eligible for programs or tax deductions such as the Earned Income Tax Credit or EITC that I've mentioned before and that is mentioned in your book. When it comes to regressive taxes, like for example, sales tax, these are taxes where everyone is taxed at the same rate. So it's not based on any sort of income. People who are impoverished pay the same exact tax as those who are wealthy. So in that sense, impoverished people are paying a higher percentage of their income in these taxes compared to the wealthy. Because 10% for someone who is struggling in terms of paying a sales tax is much more difficult than someone who is wealthy. So when it comes to these types of these two extremes, we say that the source of funding is either progressive or regressive in terms of the taxes themselves. So we have progressive versus regressive taxes and some in between these two poles on the continuum. When it comes to the actual policy or program, we refer to these as either redistributive or non-redistributive or not redistributive. So just remember, progressive taxes in terms of a source of funding are tied to redistributive policies or programs. Regressive taxes as a source of funding are tied to non-redistributive policies and programs. The other thing I want to talk about involves taxes as a way to influence / control behavior. We've talked about controlling before, so this is kind of looking at it from that angle. So taxes can influence economic behaviors. This seems more obvious, I guess. So when we think of, investments or savings that are tied to the tax code and the kinds of taxes we pay and the deductions that we get. But taxes also influence social behaviors. So for example, deciding when to retire, whether or not to have children, whether or not to care for relatives, and a number of other behaviors. So for example, I'm going to use the examples that are in the book. So for example, taxes can control populations in terms of population growth or controlling population growth. So either to encourage having babies, so getting tax credits for children, or discouraging having children by having baby taxes, so that if you have a baby, you get taxed X amount per your income, for example. Similarly, we can have tax deductions that are given to people to care for, not kill, care for their elderly relatives or their ill relatives. And the reason for this is that it actually is cheaper for the government to do that than to pay for the care themselves. So in these ways, these deductions and credits or taxes are controlling what people are doing when it comes to their private lives. Another way is that taxes influence socially undesirable or harmful behaviors. So, for example, we have taxes on cigarettes, so that's influencing smoking behavior. We have taxes on alcohol, influencing drinking behavior. Gambling. So these are the so-called sin taxes. But in more recent years, we've seen this sort of tax expand to include other harmful behaviors, especially when it comes to children. So, for example, taxing sodas and candy. One key factor in all of this, however, to kind of keep in mind in terms of these sort of taxes on socially undesirable and harmful behaviors is that they are regressive because everyone is paying the same tax rate. So someone who has a lower income or who's in poverty and is paying these huge taxes on tobacco and alcohol, that's going to affect them more than it is for someone who may be more likely to afford it. So it's in a way disadvantaging those who are poor. But if they actually change the behavior, then it's kind of a positive thing. So I don't know. It's a sticky issue. But nonetheless, it's just something to be aware of. Okay, so let's move on to voluntary giving. These involve private contributions, and sometimes they're described as charity, and other times they're referred to as philanthropy. And these are two different concepts. So, charity involves what we typically think of as giving to quote unquote the poor, whereas philanthropy is seen as more highbrow, if you will. It's giving to a broader range of cultural, religious, research, or religious activities. But nonetheless, both involve voluntary contributions in the form of donations of some form. What's really interesting, I think, is that there are about 1.8 million nonprofit agencies, mostly registered as 501c3 organizations. That 501c3 designation is what allows a nonprofit to have tax deductible status. And that's really key because that's one thing that distinguishes nonprofits from businesses because they don't have to pay the same kinds of taxes. So in your book, I think this number was about 1 million. So it's increased dramatically over the years. And in your administration class, this is going to be one of the focus areas. When it comes to philanthropy, also interesting is that philanthropic contributions provided about $400 billion to the charitable sector, and 3/4 of these are from regular people. And I don't know how else to describe them, just like people like you and me. And here's the source of that number, which is an update from what's in your book. Well, let's talk a little bit about this voluntary giving in terms of philanthropy and charity. The United States, more than a lot of other countries, relies heavily on volunteers, not just in terms of money, but also time. So, for example, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics found that volunteers spent a median of 52 hours on volunteer activities during the period from September 2014 to September 2015. So in that 1 year, that was the median. So half of the sample volunteered 52 hours of their time to some charitable organization. I don't know about you, but that seems like a lot to me in terms of the median. And then when it comes to giving in terms of money, it seems staggering as well. So that source that I cited earlier had this nice graph. I'm sorry it's all faded. It was just from the report where we can see from 1976 to 2016 how much charitable giving has increased in the United States. And by way of some other numbers behind this report, as it says, Americans gave about $410 billion in 2017. Corporate giving increased to about 20.77 billion, but note that 20.77 billion compared to that 410 billion is where the idea that 3/4 of these monies are from individual people. Foundation giving was 66.9 billion. And then just kind of breaking it down, the largest source of charitable giving came from individuals at 286.65 billion. I don't even know what that number is. It's so big. So 70% of total giving, followed by foundations, bequests or wills, and then corporations. Also interesting to note that the majority of those dollars went to religion, followed by education at 14%, and then human services, where we live, it was 12%. So that's voluntary giving in a nutshell. Let's talk about fees, where we charge people for the social work benefits that they are receiving. So there's two ways to do this in terms of charging, quote unquote. One involves contributions, where people pay into the system that they will be receiving from, and the other involves actual fees, like you would be charged when buying any product or good. In terms of contributions, we refer to these mostly as statutory, meaning that they are public law. For example, Social Security, where we pay, when we work, we pay into that system. It's the law to do so. That's what makes it statutory. And then when we retire, we receive those benefits back. Fees, on the other hand, are things like fees for service. Sometimes they might be the entire cost of the service, but more often they are sliding scales based on income. When thinking about fees, one question that comes up, for a lot of people, is why charge or make people contribute in order to receive a social welfare service? Because these are, usually vulnerable populations who need this help. Why are we charging or making them contribute? And the answer to that, as described in your book, is, well, if they're paying, then they're less likely to feel any type of shame or stigma. I mean, when was the last time that you saw someone who was receiving Social Security feel guilty or bad about that, right? Similarly, it kind of enhances, or it may enhance, the sense of social responsibility among people. As your book notes, there's, the research on this is not very convincing, but nonetheless, these are the answers, so we'll put them there. The one that I kind of go with, and these are just my opinions, are that payments restrain unnecessary overutilization. In an era, well, in every era except very few, where social service spending is either restricted or cut completely, we often see ways of trying to stop people from using services or using a lot of services. So if you think back to the video on the design of the delivery system in terms of cutting costs by inhibiting supply or inhibiting demand, this kind of goes along with that. Okay. My last two slides involve kind of thinking about public and private financing in the way your book describes in terms of, not all public financing is 100% public and not all private financing is 100% private, that there's a lot of overlap in between these two. So let's start by talking about private, even though I listed public first. So as your book notes, private voluntary giving, whether that be on an individual level, a foundation level, or a corporate level, is tax deductible. So there are tax benefits to voluntary giving. So as Gilbert and Terrell note then, private generosity in this sense is partially private altruism, wanting to give, but also partially a tax break. So the question becomes, if tax benefits are removed, how many people would actually give the amount that they give? And some studies suggest that a large portion would not give. Therefore, these tax benefits that they're getting, which are part of public financing, right? So if they're getting tax breaks, that's less money into the public sector. So in a sense, here we have this public and private overlap. Now, there's also some terminology issues. Private organizations do receive public funding, and this has become increasingly so over the years. And yet, the private sector often refers to itself in terms of the nonprofits or what have you as the independent sector because they're supposed to be autonomous and independent from the control of government. But if they're receiving public monies, then there's going to be some limits on their autonomy and some level of control. The second issue has to do with the term voluntary in terms of private voluntary giving in the sense of how voluntary is voluntary giving. So this is the issue of sometimes feeling peer pressure to give, especially at workplaces or, a friend asking for their child, who is selling gift wrapping paper to fundraise for their school. There's a sense of pressure, community pressure to participate. So is it really voluntary? I'll let you be the judge. Now let's flip over to the public part in this public versus private financing issue. So the main issue has to do with public financing of what's called private welfare. So tax expenditures, which can be tax credits, deductions, preferences, exclusions, etc. Basically, anytime the government doesn't tax at the level it normally would, is a way, or these are a way, that government is directing resources to influence private activity. So for example, when we have tax loopholes or employee fringe benefits, exclusions for paying taxes on public assistance income, so that kind of does make sense if you think about it. If I'm receiving welfare, I shouldn't be taxed on that income because the whole point is I don't have an adequate income and I need that assistance. But also pension deductions. Basically, all of these are ways in which the government is not taking income that could be used for social welfare and instead is giving that break, if you will, to businesses, to corporations, to individual people in the hope that by doing so, it can either further private charity work or assist in the public good when it comes to private individual welfare. So that's the crux of what Gilbert and Terrell were writing about when it comes to kind of thinking about public and private sources of funds as separate entities when really we can't do that. There's too much overlap, too much connection, and while it's important to understand the different sources, we also have to understand where they come together. Okay, so that's about it for this. So this is the end of part one, and there's only one part left to go, part two. So how excited are we that we're almost done with Gilbert and Terrell, and we've learned so much. Okay, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and thank you, and bye.